And through it all, Wallace's ghost walks beside him. The memory of Stirling Bridge, the defiance at Westminster, the agony at Smithfield, these become more than stories. They become a war cry. Scots ride into battle shouting, "Wallace!" as though the fallen guardian himself still swung his great sword in their ranks. Edward Longshanks does not live to see how his cruelty will backfire. In 1307, the Hammer of the Scots breathes his last, leaving his weaker son, Edward II, to inherit the war. Under his faltering leadership, the English grip begins to loosen. Wallace is gone. But the seed he planted has taken root, watered by blood, and nourished by memory. Scotland's fight is no longer a rebellion, it is a revolution. The death of William Wallace does not end Scotland's struggle, it transforms it. The burden now falls squarely on Robert the Bruce, crowned King of Scots in 1306. But his crown is made not of gold, but of thorns. At first, Bruce's reign is a disaster. Edward's armies thunder north with brutal efficiency. Bruce's supporters are hunted, his family imprisoned or executed. His wife and sisters are locked in cages displayed like trophies. His brothers are dragged to their deaths. Bruce himself is forced into exile, fleeing into the wilds, hiding on windswept islands and desolate hillsides. Like Wallace before him, he becomes a hunted man, but Bruce is not crushed. He learns from Wallace's triumphs and his defeats. Wallace had shown the Scots how to strike fear into the English, how to use the land as a weapon, how to fight, not with ranks of knights, but with the fierce resolve of common men. Bruce adopts these lessons, but tempers them with patience and strategy. From 1307 onward, Bruce wages a war of attrition. He avoids direct battles he cannot win, striking instead at castles, convoys, and isolated garrisons. His men melt into the forests and bogs, then strike again, tireless as wolves. Castle by castle, stronghold by stronghold, Scotland is wrested back from English hands. Meanwhile, the spirit of Wallace fuels the cause. Men who once fought under him now rally to Bruce. The memory of Wallace's martyrdom hardens their resolve. They are no longer simply fighting against Edward, they are fighting for Wallace, for every Scot who died with sword in hand or rope at the gallows. By 1314 the tide has turned. Edward II, weak and indecisive, inherits his father's war, but at none of his iron will. Bruce seizes the moment. He lays siege to Stirling Castle, one of Scotland's most strategic fortresses. The English crown cannot afford to lose it. Edward II gathers a massive army, perhaps the largest ever sent into Scotland, determined to crush Bruce once and for all. The stage is set for Bannockburn. In June of 1314, on the fields near Stirling, two armies face one another. Edward's host is vast, filled with armoured knights, archers and banners fluttering in the summer wind. Bruce's force is smaller, composed largely of infantry wielding spears, their armour patchwork, their ranks hardened by years of struggle. It is not just a battle for a castle, it is a battle for Scotland's very soul. As the armies clash, the spirit of Wallace seems to stride across the field. The schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen perfected since Falkirk, stand unbroken against the English cavalry. The ground, chosen carefully by Bruce, turns against Edward's knights, bogging them down, breaking their charge. At the height of the fight, as chaos swirls, Bruce himself rides forward, striking down an English knight before the eyes of both armies. It is a moment of courage that recalls Wallace at Stirling, a reminder that Scotland's kings are not to hide behind thrones, but to fight in the mud beside their men. When the dust settles, the English army is shattered. Edward II flees the field, abandoning his troops. Bannockburn is not just a victory, it is a miracle. Against all odds, against every cruelty and every execution, Scotland stands free. And though Wallace did not live to see this triumph, it is his shadow that hovers over Bannockburn. His rebellion lit the first spark. His death gave it fire. His memory marched with Bruce's men as surely as any soldier of flesh and blood. The fields of Bannockburn echo for generations. What Wallace began in defiance, Robert the Bruce secures in triumph. The victory in June 1314 is not just military, it is psychological. The myth of English invincibility has been shattered. Scotland, bloodied but unbowed, has proven that a smaller nation, united by resolve, can withstand even the mightiest crown in Christendom. But Bannockburn does not end the war. Edward II refuses to recognize Bruce as king. For years, skirmishes and raids continue, the borders smouldering with violence. Yet the tide has turned. Scotland holds the advantage. The English throne, racked with its own instability, cannot muster the crushing strength it once wielded. In 1320, a new weapon emerges, not of sword or spear, but of parchment and ink. At the Abbey of Arbroath, Scotland's nobles draft a letter to Pope John XXV, known to history as the Declaration of Arbroath. It is more than a plea for recognition of Robert the Bruce as king. It is a manifesto of nationhood, an immortal statement of freedom. Its words thunder with the same spirit that once burned in Wallace. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we fight, but for freedom, which no honest man gives up, but with his life. Here, in Latin script on vellum, is the essence of Wallace's rebellion, carried forward by Bruce and now enshrined as the creed of a people. Scotland is not merely land, it is not merely crown or castle, it is a community bound by the will to be free, and that freedom cannot be extinguished by conquest. The Pope, pressured by the Declaration and by Scotland's military strength, eventually recognises Robert the Bruce as king. Edward II's authority collapses at home, and in 1328 the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton finally acknowledges Scotland's independence. After decades of bloodshed, the dream for which Wallace fought, though he did not live to see it, becomes reality. And yet, Wallace's presence is felt everywhere in this triumph. Though Bruce wears the crown, it was Wallace who lit the path. Though noble seals are pressed into the Declaration, it was Wallace's voice, defiant before the English judges, that first declared that no Scot owed allegiance to Edward. His body was quartered, scattered to the winds, but his words became immortal. In the chronicles of the time, Wallace is remembered as both outlaw and guardian, both rebel and patriot. To the English crown, he was destroyed. To Scotland, he became indestructible. William Wallace's life was brief, violent, and tragic. He rose from obscurity, a man without noble title or great inheritance, to become the embodiment of his nation's defiance. He fought not for crown, not for riches, but for the simple and unyielding idea that Scotland should be free. In his own lifetime, he was hunted, betrayed, and destroyed. His body was torn apart, his name cursed by English lips. Yet in death, he became greater than any army, greater even than kings. The chronicles of Scotland kept his memory alive through the dark centuries that followed. Blind Harry's epic poem, The Wallace, written in the 15th century, transformed him into a near-mythic figure, giant, unstoppable, a scourge of England. It was not strict history, but it was something perhaps more powerful. Legend. Through those verses, Wallace lived again in the imaginations of farmers, soldiers, and schoolboys, passed from one generation to the next. In the centuries that followed, whenever Scotland's independence was threatened or its identity questioned, Wallace's name returned like a battle cry. His martyrdom became a touchstone of national pride, a reminder that liberty was not granted by kings, but seized by the courage of ordinary men. Even beyond Scotland, his story found resonance. In an age of rising nation-states and peoples struggling for self-determination, Wallace became a symbol of resistance against tyranny. His words, "I was never his subject," echo with the timeless conviction that no ruler may own the soul of a people. Today, his image stands carved in stone at the National Wallace Monument near Stirling, gazing across the fields where he once shattered an English army. His story is taught in schools, sung in ballads, retold in film and song. Myths have blurred with facts, yet the essence remains. A man who gave everything, even his life, for freedom. Kings and empires rise and fall, but William Wallace endures, not as conqueror, not as sovereign, but as something rarer, the spirit of a people who refused to kneel. His legacy is not measured in crowns, castles, or treaties. It is measured in the enduring belief that freedom, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished. William Wallace died in 1305, but William Wallace never died at all. The walls of fate are closing around him. By the early 1300s, William Wallace is a ghost haunting Edward Longshanks. The English king has broken Scotland's armies, built stone fortresses across the land, and scattered the nobility into factions. Yet the rebellion refuses to die because one man refuses to yield. For Edward, so long as Wallace draws breath, his conquest is incomplete. Wallace is not merely a fighter, he is a symbol. His very existence whispers to the Scots that resistance is still possible, and so the English crown puts a price on his head, vast enough to tempt even the proudest of men. For years, Wallace evades them. He slips through forests and glens, hides in monasteries, appears suddenly at night with steel flashing in his hand, then vanishes before dawn. Ballads speak of him moving like a phantom, striking terror into garrisons and emboldening the common. Folk who still whisper his name, but even phantoms grow weary. Wallace has spent a decade on the run, bearing wounds, carrying grief, watching friends fall one by one. He is not invincible, he is flesh and blood. The end comes not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of betrayal. John de Menteith, a Scottish knight of noble blood, enters the story. Some say he was an opportunist who saw in Wallace's capture a path to Edward's favour. Others whisper darker motives, envy of Wallace's fame, resentment of his humble origins, or simple greed. In August of 1305, Menteith lures Wallace into a trap near Glasgow. Perhaps he promised news of a rising or safe passage or shelter for the night. We do not know the words he used. What we know is that Wallace came, weary and trusting enough to believe he had found a friend, and instead found chains. English soldiers close around him. Wallace resists, of course. He always resists. But he is outnumbered, and the years of flight and hardship have taken their toll. The great warrior who once strode across Stirling Bridge like a Titan is dragged down. By the weight of betrayal, bound in irons, he is carried south. His fate is no longer uncertain. Edward will not let this moment pass quietly. He has waited too long for this prize. Wallace is to be made an example. His capture not just a victory, but a performance. The road to London stretches ahead. Every town he passes through will see him paraded, not as Scotland's hero, but as England's captive. The ghost has been caught. Now comes the king's revenge. The The summer of 1305 finds London seething with anticipation. Rumours swirl through the markets and alehouses, whispers carried on the wind. William Wallace has been captured. The name alone is enough to stir curiosity, hatred, and fear. To the English he is a rebel, a murderer, a man whose defiance has bled their armies and scorched their villages. To Edward, he is unfinished business, the wound in his pride that will not heal until purged with blood. Wallace is dragged south in chains, his journey a theatre of humiliation. In every town, crowds gather to jeer, to throw filth, to gawk at. The giant once whispered about as if he were more legend than man. The man who once carried a 6-foot sword now shuffles like a beast on display, stripped of weapons, stripped of dignity, but not yet stripped of spirit. On August 23rd, Westminster, Hall becomes the stage for his final reckoning. The hall itself is a monument to English power, its massive timbered roof looming overhead like the ribs of a giant beast, its stone walls carved with heraldry proclaiming conquest and dominion. Here, Wallace is brought before a panel of judges, whose verdict has already been written. The charges are read aloud: treason against Edward, robbery, murder, sacrilege. Each word drips with venom, each accusation designed not to debate but to condemn. Yet the bitter irony hangs heavy in the air. Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward, had never acknowledged him as king. How then could he be a traitor to a monarch he did not serve? When asked to speak, Wallace's voice does not tremble. He does not beg, nor does he flatter. Instead, he delivers the words that will echo long after his body is dust. I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. I owe him no allegiance, he's not my king. The defiance ripples through the hall like thunder. For a heartbeat, even the air seems to still. But Edward's court has no patience for truth. The sentence is pronounced, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most savage execution the English crown reserves for traitors. It is not death they seek, but obliteration. Wallace is to be destroyed not just in body but in memory, broken so completely that no man will dare follow his path. And so on that grey August morning, the spectacle begins. Wallace is stripped naked, bound to a wooden hurdle, and dragged through the streets of London by a horse. His flesh scrapes against the cobblestones, leaving a crimson trail through the city. Crowds surge to watch, children dart forward to hurl stones, vendors sell food and drink as though this were a festival. The man who once defied the might of England is paraded like refuse, hauled toward Smithfield, where the execution ground waits. There, in the open air, the ritual of horror unfolds. Wallace is hanged, but not to die, lifted by the noose until he chokes on the edge of death, then cut down, gasping. The executioner's knives flash, slicing his body open, pulling his entrails into the light as the crowd roars. His heart, his manhood, each indignity is inflicted with calculated cruelty. His body is then quartered, his limbs hacked from the trunk, his head severed and raised high before the masses. The parts are scattered to the corners of Britain: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth. His head, tarred to preserve it, is mounted upon London Bridge, the first head ever displayed there, a grim warning to all who pass beneath. Edward believes the lesson is clear. This is the price of rebellion. This is what awaits those who dream of freedom. But in truth, a different lesson takes root. For Wallace's death, meant to silence, instead gives him voice eternal. The crowd disperses, the city quiets, but the story spreads. The name of William Wallace is carried back to Scotland not as that of a defeated traitor, but as a martyr. And martyrs, Edward will learn too late, do not die. They endure, they inspire. When the smoke clears from Smithfield and Wallace's butchered remains are scattered to the winds, Edward Longshanks believes he has won. The rebellion's heart has been cut out, paraded, and left to rot on spikes. Scotland, so he thinks, is broken, but tyrants never grasp the power of martyrdom. Wallace's death does not smother resistance, it fans it into a roaring blaze. News of his execution spreads northward, carried by merchants, travellers, and whispering tongues. In taverns and at hearths, men speak of the horrors inflicted upon him, of how he faced his tormentors with unbroken defiance, of how his last words thundered with a truth no sword could silence. I was never his subject. To the common folk, these stories are not tales of defeat, but of courage, a reminder that freedom is worth even the most terrible price. In the months after Wallace's death, a restless energy grips Scotland. Rebellion simmers anew. It finds its vessel not in the shadow of Wallace, but in a man who has long hovered between loyalty and ambition. Robert the Bruce. Bruce, unlike Wallace, is of noble blood. Earl of Carrick, grandson of a claimant to the throne. He has fought at times for Edward, at times against him, shifting allegiance like a man caught between fear and destiny. But the brutality of Wallace's execution and the growing fury of his countrymen push him toward a choice he can no longer avoid. In 1306, Bruce seizes his moment. Inside a church at Dumfries, he confronts John Comyn, his rival for leadership of Scotland. Tempers flare, daggers flash, and when the blood spills onto the altar, Bruce crosses a line from which there is no return. With Comyn dead, Bruce claims the crown. He is crowned King of Scots at Scone, taking up the banner Wallace once carried in his calloused hands. But Bruce does not inherit a kingdom, he inherits a battlefield. Edward responds with fire and iron, sending armies north, burning abbeys, slaughtering Bruce's supporters, forcing him into exile. At first, Bruce's cause seems as doomed as Wallace's final stand at Falkirk. Yet where Wallace fought with sheer defiance, Bruce fights with patience, cunning, and the long vision of a king. But triumph brings with it a heavier burden. For Edward Longshanks does not forgive defeat. Even as Wallace savours his victory, the King of England sharpens his vengeance. The victory at Stirling Bridge transforms William Wallace overnight. The outlaw who once fought with a handful of men in the forests is now hailed across the kingdom as guardian of Scotland. In the absence of a king, he carries the burden of a nation's hope upon his broad shoulders. But Scotland is no simple prize to govern. The nobles, long accustomed to their rivalries and jealousies, eye Wallace with suspicion. Many resent his rise, for he is no earl, no baron, no heir to ancient titles. He is the son of a minor landholder, a man lifted not by lineage but by the sword. To them, Wallace is a reminder that the war is being shaped not by pedigree, but by courage. Yet the common people revere him. To the shepherds, the farmers, the villagers who have borne the brunt of English occupation, Wallace is not just a leader but a symbol. He embodies their defiance, their stubborn refusal to bow. His name is carried on the wind, sung in taverns, and whispered at hearths until it seems that every Scot, from lowliest serf to greatest laird, knows it. Wallace does not waste the momentum. In the months following Stirling, he leads daring raids into northern England. Northumberland and Cumberland feel the bite of Scottish steel. Villages are burned, garrisons cut down, castles left smouldering in his wake. It is not conquest Wallace seeks, but vengeance and warning. Let Edward's people feel, if only for a moment, the suffering their king has inflicted on Scotland. Yet these raids, though bold, sow unease among the Scottish nobles. Many fear Wallace's aggression will provoke Edward into mustering of fury. Scotland cannot withstand, and in truth Edward needs little provocation. Longshanks is enraged by the disaster at Stirling. For a man who has conquered Wales and cowed France, to be humiliated by a rebel from the Highlands is intolerable. His vengeance is not hasty, it is deliberate, calculated, and immense. He gathers one of the largest armies medieval England has ever seen. Knights in glittering mail, longbowmen in their thousands, infantry hardened by campaigns abroad. Chroniclers estimate his host at over 20,000 strong, a storm rolling inexorably north. By midsummer of 1298, that storm reaches Scotland. Edward himself rides at its head, his banners blazing with the lions of England. His intent is simple: to crush Wallace, to shatter the rebellion, and to stamp out forever the dream of Scottish independence. Wallace, for his part, knows what is coming. He gathers his men, rallies his supporters, and prepares to meet the English in open battle. His choice of ground will be crucial, for against such overwhelming numbers, only cunning and terrain can balance the scales. That ground will be found near a small town called Falkirk, July 22nd, 1298. The fields outside Falkirk shimmer in the summer heat, though the air carries not peace but the thunder of approaching war. Edward Longshanks has arrived at the head of a colossal army, a force dwarfing anything Scotland can muster. Chroniclers speak of near 20,000 men, armoured knights, seasoned infantry, and, most dangerous of all, thousands of longbowmen from Wales, archers, whose arrows fall like iron rain. William Wallace knows he cannot match such numbers in open combat. His strength lies in cunning, in using the land itself as his ally. On the rolling fields near Falkirk, he arranges his men into dense circles of spearmen, known as schiltrons. Each formation bristles outward like the spines of a hedgehog, long, wooden pikes angled to ward off cavalry charges. Between these circles, narrow gaps are left, filled with archers and guarded by small cavalry units. Behind them, boggy ground and marshes make the English advance perilous. It is a bold plan. If the schiltrons hold, the English knights, so long the terror of Europe, may break upon them like waves against rock. The morning sun climbs, dust rises from the English host as they deploy across the field, trumpets blare, banners snap in. The wind. Then with a roar, the first English cavalry surge forward, their lances levelled, their horses pounding the earth like drums of doom. They crash against the schiltrons and break. The Scottish spears bite deep, skewering horses, unseating riders, sending armoured men tumbling into the mud. The knights recoil, stunned. A second charge follows, then a third, but again the spearmen stand firm, their walls of wood and will, refusing to yield. Cheers rise from the Scots. For a moment, hope flickers. Perhaps Falkirk, like Stirling, will be their triumph, but Edward is no fool. Where brute force fails, strategy answers. He orders forth his Welsh longbowmen. Thousands of bowstrings draw back, and with a hiss like a storm wind, arrows darken the sky. They fall mercilessly upon the trapped schiltrons. The spearmen have little defence. Shields are scarce, armour rarer still. Men fall in heaps, skewered, where they stand. Gaps open in the circles, panic spreads. The once solid formations, so disciplined and defiant, begin to waver under the relentless hail. Edward sees the weakness and strikes. His cavalry charge again, this time slamming into shattered lines. Blood churns with mud as the battlefield collapses into chaos. The Scottish cavalry, small, poorly led and commanded by nobles distrustful of Wallace, flees, abandoning the infantry to their fate. By afternoon, the field is a slaughterhouse. Thousands of Scots lie dead, their bodies tangled in the broken pikes that had promised salvation. Wallace himself survives, retreating into the forests with the remnants of his army. But the cost is devastating. The dream that blazed so brightly at Stirling is drowned in blood at Falkirk. Edward Longshanks surveys the field with grim satisfaction. His vengeance is complete, for now. Wallace's army is broken, his reputation among the nobles tarnished, his guardianship slipping through his grasp. Yet though defeated, Wallace is not destroyed. From the shadows his fight will continue, for men like Wallace do not measure victory in a single battle, nor defeat in a single loss. His struggle is larger, older, deeper. It is the struggle of a people who refuse to surrender their freedom. The fields of Falkirk are still heavy with the stench of death when Wallace slips into the forests. His army is gone, scattered, broken, or lying silent in the mud. The victory at Stirling Bridge, once a beacon, now feels like a distant memory. For Edward Longshanks, Falkirk is vengeance. For Wallace, it is ruin. Yet worse than the battlefield defeat is what follows in the halls of power. Scotland's nobles, who had never fully embraced Wallace's rise, now seized their chance. Many had abandoned him in the heat of battle, their cavalry retreating when their men were needed most. Now they whisper that it was Wallace's recklessness, his arrogance, that brought disaster. They do not say aloud what truly stings them, that a man of low birth, a man not of their kind, had stood above them as guardian of Scotland. In 1298, not long after Falkirk, Wallace resigns his guardianship. The burden passes to Robert Bruce, the young Earl of Carrick, ambitious and calculating, and to John Comyn, heir of a rival family. Together they represent Scotland's fractured nobility, united less by purpose than by necessity. Wallace, stripped of authority but not of spirit, does not vanish. Instead, he slips into the role he knows best, the shadowed warrior. He continues to strike at the English where he can, raids, ambushes, sudden strikes that vanish like mist. But his resources are dwindling, his allies fewer than ever. By 1299, Wallace makes a desperate gamble. He travels abroad, crossing first into France, where Scotland's ancient alliance with the French crown might yet bring aid. He appeals to King Philip V, seeking soldiers, money, ships, anything to sustain Scotland's resistance. There is sympathy but little substance. France is consumed by its own quarrels with England and offers only words. Some chronicles claim Wallace may even have travelled to Rome, appealing to Pope Boniface VIII for recognition of Scotland's cause. Whether true or not, what is certain is that Wallace found no army waiting for him, no salvation in foreign courts. When he returned to Scotland, it was not at the head of allies, but alone, stepping once more into a land darkened by betrayal and fear. The years that follow are merciless. Edward continues his iron grip, building castles, installing sheriffs, and grinding Scotland beneath his heel. The nobles, divided and fearful, play their dangerous game of shifting allegiances. Some bend to Edward, others resist half-heartedly. Few dare open defiance, and William Wallace, once guardian, once hero of Stirling Bridge, becomes an outlaw once more, a hunted man. a shadow pursued by the relentless will of the English king. That spring, English armies crossed the border like a plague of locusts, their banners snapping in the wind. They descend first upon Berwick-upon-Tweed, Scotland's great port city, a place of trade and prosperity. What follows is not battle, but butchery. Chroniclers later write that rivers ran red with blood. Men, women, children, even babes at the breast, fall beneath English swords. Some accounts speak of 17,000 slain in a single day. The massacre of Berwick sears itself into Scottish memory like a brand, a wound that would fester for generations. Edward, satisfied, strips Balliol of crown and dignity. In a gesture of calculated humiliation, he forces the Scottish king to stand in public in little more than a tunic, like a chastised servant, before sending him into exile. Scotland, once proud and free, lies prostrate beneath England's heel. But among the shadows of this devastation, a spark flickers. In the hearts of men who refuse to bend, that spark waits for kindling. One of those hearts belongs to a young giant from Renfrewshire, William Wallace. Scotland, in the wake of Berwick, is a land in chains. Edward Longshanks installs his sheriffs and tax collectors, his judges and priests. The very symbols of Scottish nationhood, the royal seals, the sacred relics of kingship, even the ancient stone of destiny on which generations of monarchs were crowned, are seized and carried south to England. The message is clear: Scotland is no longer a kingdom but a possession. To the nobles, broken and divided, resistance seems impossible. Some bow their heads, others barter their loyalty, a few retreat to their strongholds in silence. But to men of humbler birth, submission is a bitter poison. They feel it in every demand for tribute, in every insult from an English garrison, in every stolen harvest. The anger smoulders in village hearths and in the fields, where whispers of defiance pass faster than the wind. It is here that William Wallace begins to emerge. Not as a crowned king, not as a knight of high estate, but as something rarer, a leader born of the people. Accounts of his early defiance are clouded by legend, half history and half myth. Some say his hatred was kindled by the murder of his father at English hands. Others speak of a woman, Marion Braidfute, whose death at the orders of an English sheriff drove Wallace into open revolt. What is certain is this: Wallace did not bend. He was a man of imposing presence, towering above most, with arms strong, enough to wield a claymore no ordinary soldier could lift for long. But his strength was not his only weapon. Wallace knew the land, the forests and rivers, the hidden paths through marsh and moor. He fought not as the English expected in neat lines and armoured ranks, but with ambush, surprise and fire. The first skirmishes are small, almost invisible on the map of kingdoms. An English patrol ambushed in a glen, a sheriff struck down in retribution, a garrison found slaughtered in the night. To Edward, these are the acts of bandits, nuisances to be swept away. But to the people of Scotland, they are signs of hope. Each act of defiance becomes a spark, each victory, no matter how small, a reminder that the conqueror is not invincible. By 1297, the spark has spread into flame. Wallace is no longer a nameless outlaw, but a rallying figure. Men flock to him, farmers with pitchforks, hunters with bows, even minor nobles who see in him a chance to strike back at England. His name travels by word of mouth, carried by minstrels, whispered in churches, etched in the hearts of those who dare dream of freedom. The rebellion grows bolder. English garrisons are attacked, supplies seized, tax collectors driven out or killed. Wallace's followers strike and vanish, ghosts of the highlands and forests, leaving the English frustrated and furious, but Wallace knows these raids are only the beginning. To truly challenge Edward, Scotland needs not just skirmishes, but a battlefield victory. The chance comes in September of 1297 near the small town of Stirling. There, across the River Forth, an English army waits, vast, disciplined, confident. Wallace and his men, outnumbered and lightly armed, stand on the far side. What happens next will echo through the ages. September 11th, 1297, the chill of early autumn hangs over the River Forth. Mist clings to the reeds and low meadows near the town of Stirling, veiling the fields in a ghostly shroud. Across the water, the English army stirs awake, a vast host of nearly 10,000 men, a force of knights, infantry, and archers sent north by Edward Longshanks to crush the rebellion once and for all. Their commander, John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, is a seasoned noble but weary of campaigning. He expects little trouble. After all, what threat could a rabble of farmers and hillmen pose to the armoured might of England? To him, Wallace is not a general but a brigand, a criminal playing at war. Yet on the far bank, William Wallace waits. Beside him stands Andrew de Moray, a young noble who has risen in the north with equal courage, though he is already gravely wounded from earlier fighting. Their army is small, perhaps no more than 2,000 to 3,000 men. Many are poorly armed, wielding spears, axes, or whatever tools they could muster. Against the English machine of war, they seem like shadows against a storm. But Wallace sees something Surrey does not: the land itself. The River Forth is wide and deep, and the only crossing is a narrow wooden bridge. To send the English army across is to funnel them into a death trap. Wallace knows patience will be his greatest ally. The morning drags on. The English hesitate, reluctant to commit their entire army across so narrow a passage. Impatient knights clamour for battle, scoffing at the thought of delay. At last, Surrey relents. The English vanguard begins to cross, horsemen and infantry clattering across the timber span, their banners rippling in the wind. Wallace gives the signal from the high ground. The Scots descend with a roar that shakes the mist. Thousands of spears bristle like the quills of a monstrous beast. They surge not at the bridge but at its far side, cutting the English column in half. Those who have crossed are trapped, unable to retreat, while those still on the bridge are crushed in panic. Horses flail, men stumble into the river, armour dragging them to a watery grave. The slaughter is merciless. English knights, weighed down by steel, are dragged from their mounts and cut down in the mud. Infantry scatter in terror, only to be trampled by their own retreating comrades. The bridge itself collapses beneath the chaos, hurling men screaming into the cold water below. Chroniclers later claim that the river ran red with English blood. By noon, it is over. What had begun as England's sure victory ends as utter disaster. Thousands lie dead or drowned. The proud banners of Surrey's host are trampled in the mire. For the first time in living memory, Scotland has triumphed against England in open battle. News spreads like wildfire. Across the glens and highlands, in villages and castles, the tale is told again and again how William Wallace, the outlaw-turned-commander, struck down the might of Edward's army at Stirling Bridge. He is no longer a nameless rebel. He is a champion, a symbol of Scotland's defiance. For Wallace himself, the victory is intoxicating but dangerous. With Moray gravely wounded and soon to die, Wallace alone carries the mantle of leadership. The nobles of Scotland, some resentful of his low birth, must now reckon with him. And when the people cry out for a protector, Wallace answers, He is named Guardian of Scotland in the name of the absent king. It is the morning of August 23rd, 1305. London wakes not to the promise of a new day, but to the scent of blood in the air. Already the city stirs with restless energy. Merchants abandon their stalls, apprentices slip away from their workshops, and even nobles descend from their chambers. Common folk pour into the streets not for bread, nor for ale, nor for news of trade, but for the one commodity England can always provide in abundance: death. They gather as though for a festival, yet what they await is no song or pageant. It is a killing. A public unmaking of a man whose very name has become a thorn in England's flesh. The anticipation swells, thick and almost tangible, as if the entire city is holding its breath. The air itself seems heavier, weighed down by the promise of violence, and then it comes, that sound. The clip-clop of hooves echoing off stone, joined by something far more grotesque, the wet scrape of flesh against cobblestone. A trail of crimson darkens the street behind a wooden hurdle dragged by a horse. Bound naked upon it, bruised, bleeding, and battered from months of pursuit and imprisonment, lies William Wallace, the rebel, the outlaw, the man who dared to dream of a free Scotland. His body is a tapestry of torment, tapestry of... Each stone on the long 400-mile journey from Scotland has marked him. Each lash of the whip has carved another cruel memory into his flesh. His back is a checkerboard of scars, his skin hangs in tatters, and his ribs protrude like the bars of a broken cage. Yet for all the ruin, one thing remains intact: his eyes. Those eyes still burn, not with fear, but with defiance. It unsettles even the crowd. Some spit upon him, others throw filth, yet their jeers falter under the weight of his stare. For Wallace, though stripped of power, honour, and flesh, refuses the one surrender that matters most: his spirit. The scene is almost ritualistic. Children crane their necks for a glimpse. Women gasp and whisper. Men cheer in coarse voices. Priests cross themselves but do not look away. Even ravens wheel above, as if summoned to a feast. London has transformed itself into a stage, and Wallace, unwilling actor though he is, has been cast in the role of condemned traitor. But before we follow him to the scaffold, before we watch the final agony of his earthly form, we must step back. For this day, this spectacle is not merely the end of one man, it is the climax of decades of upheaval, betrayal, and blood. To understand the horror that awaits him at Smithfield, we must return to a different Scotland 35 years earlier, a land that once knew peace, and a boy who was never meant to be a legend. The year is 1270. In the green hills of Renfrewshire, far from the thunder of armies or the intrigues of royal courts, a child is born into a modest Scottish household. His father, Sir Malcolm Wallace, is a minor landowner of little renown, a man whose life revolves around tending fields, honouring his obligations, and keeping his family safe. There is no omen in the sky, no prophecy spoken, no expectation that this child, William, would one day stand at the centre of a struggle that would shape nations. Scotland in these years seems blessed. King Alexander III sits upon the throne, and his rule brings a rare kind of peace. Markets bustle, harvests are plentiful, and the great stone keeps of the nobles echo, not with the clash of arms, but with music and laughter. In villages and towns, children sleep without fear of soldiers pounding at their doors. To be born a Scot in this age is to be born into promise. Young William grows tall in this world of calm. He is not only strong but also fortunate in his education. a luxury most of his station would never know. The monks teach him Latin, the language of the church, of law, of learning. He studies not only the psalms and prayers, but the stories of ancient Rome, the rise and fall of empires, the deeds of men who shaped history. It sharpens his mind, planting in him a sense that one man's choices can alter the fate of many. Yet, William's gifts are not only of the mind. By his early 20s, he towers over his peers, nearly 6.5 feet tall, an astonishing height in an age when most men barely reach 5.5. His frame is broad, his hands strong enough to wield the massive two-handed claymore that would later become his signature weapon. In taverns and markets, people whisper about the giant from Renfrew, half in awe, half in fear. But Scotland, like a calm sea, hides dangers beneath the surface. Fate, cruel and sudden, prepares to unmake the peace that has nurtured William's youth. In March of 1286, King Alexander III, so steady a ruler, so vital a figure, rides through the darkness on a storm-lashed night near Kinghorn. No one knows why he pressed on through the gale, but his horse stumbles near a cliff. In an instant the king is gone, dashed to death on the rocks below. The shock is total. It is as though the spine of Scotland itself has broken. With Alexander's death, the kingdom's golden age ends. His heir is Margaret, the Maid of Norway, a mere child of 3 years old, who has never set foot on Scottish soil. For 4 fragile years, Scotland waits, governed by regents, suspended between hope and ruin. The people endure in uneasy quiet, but whispers grow in taverns and in noble halls alike. How long can a kingdom stand without a king? In 1290, that question finds its grim answer. Young Margaret dies on her voyage to Scotland, carried off by illness before she can even touch the land she was meant to rule. With her death, the throne lies empty, and Scotland slides into uncertainty. Rival claimants circle like wolves, each noble believing his blood more royal than the next. The threat of civil war looms, and into this vacuum of leadership, Scotland makes a fateful decision. They turn to Edward Plantagenet, Edward the Furlers of England, known already by his chilling nickname, Long Shanks. Edward Plantagenet, King of England, does not come to Scotland as a saviour. He comes as a predator who smells blood in the water. Standing well over 6 feet tall, a towering presence in an age of shorter men, Edward earns the name Long Shanks. But it is not merely his height that commands fear. It is his reputation. A warrior king hardened in the crucible of conquest. He has crushed rebellions in Gascony, subdued Wales with castles of stone and iron, and led men on crusade to the Holy Land. To the Scots, desperate for arbitration in their succession crisis, Edward presents himself as a judge. But behind his solemn promises lies ambition sharpened like a blade. The Scottish nobles, fractured by rivalries, invite Edward to arbitrate the succession. At stake is the crown itself, contested by more than a dozen claimants, the most prominent. Among them John Balliol and Robert Bruce, grandfather of the man who would one day claim eternal renown. The nobles believe Edward will act as a neutral overseer, that his judgment will restore balance and preserve peace. Instead, they have placed the wolf within the fold. Edward selects John Balliol, a man of noble lineage but fragile will. Balliol is not chosen for his strength of character but for his weakness. Edward sees him as pliable, a puppet whose strings he can pull from Westminster. And indeed, once crowned, Balliol finds himself overshadowed at every turn by Edward's demands. The humiliation begins subtly, but soon grows unbearable. Edward insists that Scottish nobles must swear direct homage to him, the English king, as though Scotland were no more than a feudal fief. Legal disputes that once belonged to Scottish courts are now dragged before English judges. Knights of Scotland, once proud defenders of their own realm, are forced to serve in Edward's foreign wars. Each decree is a tightening noose, choking Scotland's sovereignty. For the ordinary Scot, the change is palpable. Where once they answered to their own lords and customs, now they see English sheriffs enforcing foreign laws, English soldiers billeted in their villages, and English clerks parcelling out land as though Scotland were spoils of conquest. In alehouses, bitter jokes mask deeper resentment. Farmers whisper that their king is no king at all but Edward's lapdog. By 1296, even John Balliol can endure no more. Though timid by nature, he attempts to resist, declaring Scotland's independence and forging an alliance with France. In Edward's eyes, this is nothing less than rebellion. His response is merciless, swift, and absolute.